wear a hat.
Yeah, phone's off, phone's on silent.
Oh, no, Indigenous.
Hello. I think I'm on. Hello? Hello? Don't smack it. That's how you break them. Come on, man. Hello? Ah, there we go. Would anyone else like to test their microphone? Whoops.
Hello. Hello? Yep, I'm on.
Great.
Hello.
Testing, testing.
Perfect. Well, thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this talk, contemporary, I suppose, Gods, Rites and Relics. My name's Gerakaris. I'm a curator based in Western Sydney, and I'm currently the Curatorial Program Manager at 4A Centre for Contemporary Asian Art, which is based in the Haymarket in Sydney. So today we're joined on this, I just saw you laughing at me, we're joined on this panel by Ramesh, Nithiyendran, Tony Albert and Dr. Rakini Devi. I guess the main kind of guiding principle for this talk will be a discussion on a sort of post-secularism and decolonization, post-colonialism. Jürgen Habermas described post-secularism as the coexistence of faith and reason in our kind of contemporary society that we're in. And I'm trying to kind of redefine it as faith as pertaining to the self rather than a collective, or faith as a marker of personal identity. To begin, I think we should talk to a work that probably you've all seen today, Ramesh's new work that's standing guarding the entry to Sydney Contemporary. Would you like to share kind of how that came together? It's quite an ambitious piece. Where does it come from?
Thanks, Con. Thanks for the introductions. It's really amazing to be sitting here and talking to everybody. And we're on Aboriginal land, which is a place which is really amazing to present artwork on. You know, it's a place of the oldest continuing cultures in the world, and kind of unfathomable creativity and ingenuity, you know, kind of exists where we're making work and presenting work. So I think that's always a really grounding thing to think about. So the work that you'll see as you enter Carriageworks, which is outside, so it's a new outdoor sculpture. It's a double-sided bronze figure. And I made it in clay in a foundry in Melbourne, and then we cast it in bronze, patinated it, and painted it. And within that work specifically, I was actually looking at the function of door gate guardians, you know, particularly across South Asia. And I'm kind of interested in the way in which figurative sculpture is iterated across different, primarily civic spaces, and the way in which certain types of figuration can function socially, ideologically, but also functionally. You know, how does the kind of representation of a certain type of figure provoke certain movements through spaces? How can these sculptures act as thresholds for different spaces? And with that work specifically, I can talk about it for a long time, but it's a work I've wanted to make for a long time, and it has a lot. It's double-sided, so the side where you exit on is actually my favorite side. So upon exit, go and look at that side. It's a little bit more dirty, it's a bit more abject, it's a bit more monstrous. Where the polychromatic side, which is the main entry point, has a lot of references for me to, antiquity, but also this idea of syncretisms, the way in which lots of visual languages over time have emerged through cross-cultural contact, and not to say there haven't been different kinds of power imbalances that have been involved in those sites of contact, but I'm quite interested in this idea of a regionally specific dialogue, and especially when I start researching South Asian vernacular sculpture, or even look at very regionally specific sculptures, what's really interesting is that you often always find that what we often consider regionally specific is often multi-regional, that there are often lots of different points of even geography that can impact the way we view sculptures. So that's a very long way of saying that I was interested in kind of representing an entry figure or a kind of door gate guardian that was kind of multi-historical, multi-gendered, multi-placed, multi-limbed, multi-coloured and multi-formed.
Sure. So it's taking that idea of sort of, yeah, I liked when you said like how they function in civic space and being regional, like the regional specificity, you know what I'm trying to say, specificity to a certain work. And I think that speaks really well to Rakini's performance and installation that will be happening tonight, I believe, where your work does kind of definitely speak to specific gods, specific rites and rituals. You mentioned the idea of tradition as transgression as part of your performance. Would you like to speak to those kinds of topics, what's happening there?
So I would describe my art as performing hybrid iconography. I grew up in a very multi-religious world in Kolkata, and so all those the imagery from my Catholic convent upbringing to my own family and Hindu ties and Buddhist ties. So after a million years of Indian classical dance, I sort of used that as, I drew on those to form my present practice, which is live art, painting, and dance. I'm sort of fascinated, I've always been drawn to the temporary roadside temples that happen in India during festivals. They had a big impression on me when I was growing up. And they're sort of these canopies, which are called pandals. And every festival, they house the goddess, one of my favorites being Kali. And so using those ideas, I've created environments for myself, and that's what I'd be performing in today. So it's a hybrid of both Christian, Hindu, basically icons. One of my current characters is the female pope, where I insert a predominantly female character into a very patriarchal role. And this particular installation I'm doing tonight, which is framed by one of the canopies that I designed and installed, is the body as relic. I was very fascinated by all the gruesome Catholic Church relics that I saw in Mexico. So was very drawn to all of these skeletons and skulls and bones and everything that was, openly, and also the very garish aesthetic of Mexican art and Mexican religious festivals really resonated with my own experiences of Hindu festivals, etc. So I've sort of used the hybridity of those experiences to create something, and the body as relic or as a sacred artifact, which is how I present myself as a work of art, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's important to think about live performance, especially in the context of being in a public space and how that activates your own body and how that works in particular with your work, and appropriating that visual language of, I guess, a hybrid religious upbringing and this kind of idea that Ramesh also talks to with this, I guess, East-West, in between religion aesthetic, to kind of reinterpret, religious figures in 21st century. And also you talk about feminism a lot in your work, especially with the God that you sort of specifically evoke.
So the doctorate I completed was called Urban Kali. So I've made works on the goddess Kali spanning over 20 years, and my thesis described why I found and what methods I used to use her iconography, interpreted by myself, to address global misogyny and referencing a lot of the atrocities that happen in India towards women, including female infanticide. So, not very entertaining subjects, but something that I've spent years researching. And the goddess Kali all her iconography, which has been culturally appropriated 1,000 times by, many different cultures. So one of the main reasons for presenting her as why is she relevant today in this urban modern world. And that's why I called it tradition as transgression, which is my interpretation of using powerful female religious iconography as feminist protest.
Yeah, thank you. I think this idea of commentary and engagement in contemporary politics, regionally specific for your case, or I guess globally as well, is kind of how we can bring Tony further into this conversation. We are situated right now in Redfern, a quite significant suburb for the Indigenous population of Australia, that as I was on the way here, I saw that where the block used to be has just been knocked down. So I was thinking about how even centuries after, the country has been paved over, land is still being taken away, quite like from the Indigenous population. Would you like to speak to kind of your work being, I guess, socially engaged in that way, and how you attempt to rewrite or reconfigure history and reframe, I guess, the Indigenous experience in this country? Is that too loaded of a question?
No, but I might narrow it down to an idea or something like that. But that dismantling comes with, I guess, a tension of push and pull. And it's very interesting when looking at the colonial mindset within the framework of a place like Australia and how religion was used to dismantle Indigenous philosophy and belief. So what you'll find quite often, Western references to religion, say churches, were built on ceremonial sites specifically, and it's about the fastest way to dismantle any kind of religion is not only getting rid of what was there, but erecting these monuments and places of worship on top of that. So it's kind of not only extinguishing the past, it's paving what will be ideas of the future. And being brought up in the Catholic Church, there's a big tension with that for me, and it's something, if I speak to my parents about it, they kind of don't even have an answer for why that happened, but it was just part of community life, that the childcare was done through the church, that how we survived was because these places did exist. And then there's people from my family who have been led into that Christian side of that, and then the other family that have, maintained kind of a more cultural experience. So, that tension is more so what fascinates me, rather than one being right or wrong. But that it has been interesting. My journey is to look at that dismantlement and how that was used in the eradication of culture.
Sure. So I think aesthetically speaking, would you like to talk about Brothers and that work, and how that does specifically take that stained glass, very, very Catholic, or from my perspective, very orthodox kind of look at iconography?
Religion feeds into a hierarchy as well, and for me, looking at that idea of that tension, it was also the iconography, and I'm a collector of what I call Aboriginalia, but I'm a massive collector of religious iconography as well, but that's more a personal collection that I hang in my bathroom. But the representation and presentation of that iconography, it begins with the elite. So the royal kind of families and stuff, and then the church. They were the only places that could afford that kind of iconography within stained glass. And when I was given the opportunity to work with that medium, to me, that juxtapositioning and unbalancing that power by using Indigenous imagery, particularly that of people, within the technique of stained glass was, something that really interested me, and kind of turning that methodology or that representation of social status within what, I mean, quite frankly, is probably the lowest rung in Australian society, being the viewpoint of and hierarchy of Indigenous people.
Yeah, so it wasn't specifically to deify it, so to speak. It was just to use the medium and adopt through the medium that kind of intrinsic power that has come with that. And I think that's something that can be shared across all the works here, that there is that use of power and there is that co-opting of power that comes with organized religion that has been such a prevalent force, I suppose, through everyone's life and through everyone's culture. I wanted to revisit the idea of civic space again. And Tony, I think this is very interesting what you mentioned and how that, sites were forcibly taken, and move on from there and say, I guess I don't quite know where I'm going with this, I'll say that. But I'm interested in that idea of civic space and wanted to extract that more. I suppose Rakini, with the idea of Kali being so specific to your province, as you mentioned, how has it come through sort of thinking about that God? And do you, when you interpret a religious figure like that, do you kind of, acknowledge the history that's there, or do you draw from that power, or what's the kind of aim that you're coming from? It's a
combination of all of those, but speaking about public spaces, what I love about my current practice is that it's the unknown. It's going into a fairly dangerous sort of situation, especially like when I did, I have a character called Kali Madonna, so it's a combination of both. And then I've always wanted to perform near a temple in India, which I did 3 years ago, and I was terrified because it just, it's a very fragile situation. It just takes one person to take offense. I always make it very clear that what I'm doing is I always honor the source of my inspiration, but at the same time, it's totally interpreted by my own art and my own aesthetic. Every experiment is interesting because, I'm not performing to artists, I'm performing to the general public, which will be tonight as well. And the first time I unveiled the female pope was in Sweden. And the attitude there was really open. I was quite shocked, really, because I wanted to know if people would acknowledge the body, however it's presented, as something sacred in the way it has been presented. And in every case, I found that was the case. People treated my body as one of any other statue or whatever that happened to be in the cathedral. And another time, I've been very tentative about interactive work, but I also did a work where I was, again, this character, and I invited people to petition me for various things, which I would then take each petition and sew it onto myself. And I was really moved by the way people reacted and really addressed me as this icon, and their petitions were really personal and very heartfelt. So I think there's that adventure and there's that connection that you have that I don't have as a dancer, where there's the fourth wall, I'm dancing and you're watching. But when you do something in a public space, you're really engaging with people and hopefully having some sort of impression and feedback.
Yeah. In terms of public space and Ramesh and thinking about this work, are these kind of ideas prevalent when you're considering the, composition of your sculpture? Are you thinking, objectively, consciously thinking about how the people will respond? What does it mean? How does this figure that you've created greet the people, and what does that instill in them?
Yes. No, that's good. I think what a lot of contemporary artists sometimes don't talk about, because sometimes it's a bit passé, is a lot of the formal elements and the very specific formal elements of their work. And, I think within my sculptures generally, I try and kind of amplify a certain element of the handmade. And I think, and usually the scale with that scale, it's almost like 1 to 1.2 in terms of, a human, inverted commas, kind of scale. And I think when I'm making, especially large-scale sculpture, I think it's quite interesting that when you kind of can work with monumentality as a framework, the one out there isn't necessarily monumental, and you can actually reflect audiences back into the work, either literally or figuratively. And, I remember like when I was a child and I would go in, to the city on excursions, the main sculptures I'd see were these massive colonial monuments, and they were really smooth and, really dominating, for example. But I think what is an interesting point that could also be, brought into the conversation about this idea of iconography and religion and civic space is the way, I think a lot of the time in contemporary discourse, we're talking about, axes being bent and, these very notions of center and periphery being destabilized. And I think what's interesting about contemporary culture and pop culture, and especially, the internet, is that everyday people can naturally assume the status of, these almost deified icons. And, you can sometimes go into, the kind of tabloid newspapers and sometimes you see TikTok star gets robbed by blah, and there's almost a sense of flattening where, I'm not saying this is good or bad, it's just an observation, where, when I'm looking kind of historically to certain kind of icons, there is a sense of other realmness. But I think just moving through space in, society, you can look at billboards, you can look at TV, you can look at Instagram and see, everyday people, assume the status of what was historically perhaps more godlike. And I think that's a really interesting thing to occupy as an idea in artwork when you're thinking about the way in which audiences respond to your work. Because I think, like what we've all kind of talked about as well, is that I think sometimes, especially when artists and, people of color even make artwork, people kind of project this idea of a counter-narrative onto our work. Our work is challenging this. When, I think a lot of the time we're saying it's actually a bit more complex. We're interested in the tensions, we're interested in the in-betweenness. We're not necessarily interested in, creating a binary between, one view and another one. And I think that's where really interesting ideas come from. It's that kind of plurality in between.
Certainly, I definitely agree with that. Obviously, that's where anything interesting is going to come from, the in-between space. You mentioned that idea of deifying and that anyone can be the everyday, or like anyone can be the icon now, I suppose. But in your work specifically, there is an element of self-deification. An element.
Like when I went through university, like it was at an interesting time. I graduated in 2013, 2014, and we weren't really having many, at least where I was at my point in time, we weren't having very frank discussions about identity politics and imbalances, and I had to kind of learn by myself, like, what was appropriate. I didn't have, I didn't know any artists in my community I could speak to that were at a more senior level. So I literally thought, if I start using myself and my imagery, I can take responsibility for that. And I think that's kind of how I started to make art. I was always interested in figuration, but the ethics of representing other people, and especially other living people to me, were almost too much for me to handle at that time.
Is that why you maybe took a look at, I guess, the history of icons and engaged with the history of, look in the past? And
yeah, that's exactly why.
Yeah. Well, on this topic of relics, that obviously makes me think of things very museologically, and I guess the presenting of histories and cultures in a very, I guess, dry Western, ivory tower, so to speak, way. Tony, you mentioned that you're a collector of aboriginality. I can't remember the specific word you said, but that, idea of picking up things that are supposedly representative. and transforming it in your work, I wanted to touch on things like visible and native home, where you incorporate symbols, objects, and language, and especially in native home, the kind of idea of home specifically, and the shelter. Do you sort of think that these objects, how do you engage with them? Are they sort of pastiche? Are they coming from a sense of collecting and a sense of representing? Are you trying to co-opt that, that musicological voice in a way?
The word is Aboriginalia and it's made up, so don't worry about getting it wrong. My collection started as a child, and it came through I'm trying to think of the correct terminology. I was going to poor, but maybe low socioeconomic family. Everything we got was from secondhand shops, and that was the necessities. And then out of that came this passion for the discarded, and that's where I first came across these objects that, as a child, meant something very different to me than they mean now. I thought these were quite prestigious kind of members of our community. What did it mean at that point in my life to be represented on a plate or a cup or a tea towel? Came from a very innocent childhood perception of love. So, as I grew and formed my own ideas and opinions and started to understand society more, the realization was that these things weren't as lovely as I originally thought out. Actually, they were a perception and a part of our existence, not just as Aboriginal people, but as Australian people, in the classification of who we are, how we are represented, how we are presented, particularly within the interior of a home, and how did a whole generation of people identify with Aboriginal people through this kind of iconography. So it did come from a very innocent childhood perception, which I kind of am really grateful for, because I still straddle that love for those objects. And there's other Indigenous artists that collect, objects very similarly, which have very different references and meanings and ideas behind the use of those objects. But I toy between giving a voice to those objects and that very innocent perception from my childhood, which I don't ever want to lose, because something really intrinsically linked to me because of that love for that kind of iconography. But for me, it is about, and these are Western representations as well. They're of course, there's an industry now which is amazing, which is made up of Aboriginal people in control of those kind of things. But it, for me, is giving ownership and a voice to those objects, which was disallowed, or it came from a not so sincere place.
Yeah, there's this idea of, naivety, where you would come to it from, and how do you straddle the line between that and this new this found perspective of realizing that these objects aren't quite as, representative or playful as you may have found them out when you were a child. Like, how does that kind of come through in your work? Oh, yeah. How? I suppose. No, I don't know.
Can I respond as a response?
Oh, please.
Work?
I want everyone to respond to everyone. I don't want to keep talking.
I think
it was a statement, not a question.
Well, one of the first times I saw Tony's work was when I was in university, and I can't remember exactly where, but it was this massive wall, and it was just filled, and there were these little mirrors in the work. And I remember looking at it for ages, and I remember thinking what was really interesting about it, and especially now, is that you're actually, there's an element of uncertainty about the sentiment, towards the objects. You can actually sense that there's an element of, there's a problematic sense to their representation, but you can see a sense of adoration. And I think, that kind of complexity of sentiment is, reality. And I think that ability to provoke multiple readings, through the placement, and especially the placement en masse of certain things, is what I find interesting about Tony's work, and the way in which he kind of recontextualizes and repositions and works. And sometimes correct me if I'm wrong, it almost feels intuitive how you arrange some of these found objects. And I think, that feeling that it's intuitive is also really interesting. There's a sense that it's not just cerebral, but there is an emotional dimension to how these things are placed and worked with. And I think, even that space between what, some people might binarize, intuition and reason, I think that's what I find interesting about the way in which those objects are framed in your various works. Yeah.
Thanks, Ramesh. There's a fascination with me around the head and what it means to hang a head on a wall, particularly of a person of culture or colour. And I remember now that work that it was the third in a trilogy of those large installations, and I wanted to finish with the opportunity for the viewer's head to be in the work as a kind of macabre representation of that idea and that meaning. And that was the first time I felt the reflection of the viewer was integral to just wrapping up, closing off that work for me as a point of difference and reference. But definitely in a cultural sense, there's a fascination with, I don't know, when something just lacks its body and just a history of violence that's attached and heads being in jars in museums and stuff, there's something that just doesn't sit right culturally within a tourism industry of a plaster cast head or a head on a plate or a head on an ashtray that, it continues that tension.
Yeah, there's definitely a breakup between someone as a real life human being and then just seeing a head, and then that's even reflected in things like busts and of just that kind of context of this is an important person, here's just their head, and then that's meant to be a kind of symbol for, I guess, everything that they've achieved. It's I guess a very strange thing.
I just wanted to say that speaking in agreement with what you were saying, rather than I like to create my own ritual objects, or take, known objects and then, add things. Speaking of macabre, like in Hindu mythology, like the head is often the ego. So whenever I'm depicting, even in dance or in performance, the slicing off of the head or the garland of heads that goddess Kali wears is actually, it's not human sacrifice. It's actually showing that the seat of knowledge is the head, and also it's the ego. So there's a lot of her iconography shows her slicing the head and holding the head in one hand. So I actually made these a little gruesome garland of male heads, which I then, with knitting wool and things as part of performances that I did, started in Sweden, and then I sew them into a garland and wear that. And, just creating objects that have meaning for yourself rather than just grabbing, anything that's normal. So, so I do get what,
I love that idea also, because what we have attention as Indigenous people or people coming from a cultural or ethnic background is that it does hurt. You don't want to bastardize these kind of things.
That's
it's
right.
done actually with a lot of respect.
Exactly.
And sometimes there's a point of difference. The object actually becomes inauthentic, which is how we probably, I feel, I'm not doing this as a way of, I guess this week actually has been really amazing for me there's an intrinsic link between art and culture, and I've kind of had to put this line down it as well and go, there's something within the walls of a gallery or a space where, as an artist, you need a bit of that safety to
Absolutely.
Pull apart these ideas. And I love that idea of, and in both instances of other artists on the panel as well, it's the recreation of objects, and
Yep.
and it loses the the ceremonial, like
That's right.
it is different to me, and that's what's, I think, the important insensitivities that we show as people. It's not a disregard for culture or religion. It actually is. There's kind of this inauthentic part of these objects which make it okay to kind of tell these stories.
I also liked what Ramesh was saying, like when you maybe draw on your own physicality, you then take responsibility. You know, like people, you know, I've been told before by the Mexican artist, you know, Rakini, you are the art, you know. I mean, oh yeah, okay. So it sort of gave me permission. And also, if you do use your own ideas, you know, it comes from an authentic place, and you're responsible for it. You know, it's not like, you know, theatre where you're using an author's writing or whatever. It's your own. Whether it fails miserably or not, you take responsibility for it.
This idea of, I guess, the body, I think, is what everyone's been alluding to in a way. Why did you sort of, I guess, no, not why. That's pretty obvious why. I just suppose in the act of transforming your body into different sort of figures, different...
I think I'm reaching relic stage.
Yeah, I want to...
So I thought, well, you know, this is how I would like to be presented and embalmed, like today. I'm going to take photographs and send to my family, make sure I look like this. No, but it did come from my Indian classical dance background, which is very stylized, where we embody the gods, you know, in mythology. It's not about natural acting or whatever. And I sort of wanted to go beyond that, because as a visual artist, I have so many other ideas, and I also had to be very careful about of keeping my, you know, classical traditional dance aside. So I created my own markings, my own, you know, costuming and everything, which referenced it, but didn't, you know, obviously I would never, you know, wear a Indian classical costume and do something ridiculous in it, you know. So I have too much respect for my gurus. But as the body, again, if you're using your own body, it's like, you know, like one of my supervisors said, you know, your body is a canvas, you know, where your iconography, you know, where you experiment, which is exactly what I do. And as the body is transforming over the years, you know, obviously my ideas and things, I find now in my twilight years, I'm far more adventurous and daring even than I would have been, you know, in my youth, where I'd be really very terrified because I was very linked to my traditional roots. Whereas now I've given myself permission, and you know, there are all of these things, you know, body and identity and culture and all of those things. But I've had the same interests from like yourself, from a child. I just didn't know how to articulate any of it, but it's all happening now.
I also want to speak to this idea of, I guess, recreating place, which Ramesh has spoke to, about transposing the sort of door guardian, and Rakini, you building your own kind of installation in here. And that, I guess, that idea of ceremony that might come with that.
Ritual.
Yeah, well, yes. I think this, how do you find these kinds of ceremonies come through and rituals come through in your life? Where, like, is there a specific delineation between, I guess, your everyday life and then how you consider these things in practice? Is this something that you're always kind of, you know, in between?
Yes, well, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I'm one of those eccentric artists whose house resembles a set. So I have, you know, I have ritual upon ritual. I have multiple shrines, and I love the idea of rituals in different cultures, but also personal ritual, which each of us have. And I think there's a very blurred line between my performative life and my personal life, which, bleeds one into the other.
That's a very social media thing to say as well. It's our performance online that we're always, I suppose, a part of.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know. I think should we open to the floor if there's any questions? I can't see. No thoughts, no questions. We've covered all bases. We've solved it. Yeah, I don't know. Is there any last remarks, last things to share, I suppose?
One last thing.
Please.
With my upside down microphone. I think something that could be really interesting to think about, even as a proposition, is that what we're all doing is actually traditional.
Yeah.
That when we're thinking about tradition and transgression sometimes, it's quite tempting to often see them as on opposite ends of the spectrum, but, traditional practices change and they're still traditional practices, like if we see vernacular sculpture in public spaces 3D printed when they were once hand carved, with very specific, social protocols, it's still traditional practice. So I think an interesting proposition is to actually think of, even what we're doing as just as a continuum of tradition rather than almost a, counter to it. That's my philosophical note for the end. Thanks.
Someone write that down. I thought, Rakini, I thought you had something to add to that, but no.
No, I was just looking to see if anyone
Yeah.
had anything to say.
Oh, sorry, we've got a microphone, I think.
Thank you very much. I missed 5 minutes at the beginning, but I've really enjoyed hearing each of you speak about your practice. And my name's Una Ray. I'm with ArtLink magazine. And so words matter immensely. A word that I guess doesn't get a lot of traction is spirit or spirituality. And religion has very particular connotations, and you've each interestingly had hybrid experiences with Christianity and,
That's right.
And other religions or spiritual practices. I guess I'd love to hear you respond to the word or the term or the thinking of spirituality in contemporary art writing, if you like, art talk.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, I think when in describing, even when I was writing about my practice, one of the things that inspire my work now, spirituality has always been part of my life, and all religions were inspiring. I grew up with Hindu, Muslim, Parsis, in my school, etc. But in dance, I was talking to Ramesh, in fact, there's two forms of Indian classical dance. Bharatanatyam, which is very intellectual, very precise, very modernized over the centuries. And then Odissi, which is a temple art form, which I came to later, 20 years ago, and I just fell in love with it because it was a purely devotional form of dance. And the concept of performance as devotion, that was the source of all Indian classical dance, which was a temple form, and it was never for the public. So there is that personal practice that I have, no matter whether it's, whether I'm, doing a totally contemporary work of dance or whatever that I may be doing. There is always that spirituality behind it. And the embodiment of different installations that I do is also drawing on the concept of what we call bhakti, which is devotion in dance, devotion to whatever is personally that you believe in.
That was informative. I suppose also very often with Aboriginal art and spirituality get kind of bracketed together. as an other, I suppose, to the very secular culture or society that we might consider Australia to be. I love that you all were anti-binary and all those in-between spaces. But yeah, thank you.
I think the topic of spirituality is something very, good to delve into if other people would like to share. I wouldn't find myself, or I'd say that I'm very spiritual, but I do come to the ideas of religion and faith from my upbringing as being a third-generation Greek Australian, where I only go to church on Easter because it makes me feel more Greek, I suppose. Like, I don't have any relationship to that, to faith, to religion, and anything like that. So for me, this kind of topic is, I guess, purely academic and coming from a very contemporary standpoint where spirituality is, a very different mode of practice, There's whatever, you can find spirituality in kind of any medium. Do these things kind of influence your thinking, Ramesh, or no?
I think it's interesting. Like, for me, the distinction between religion and spirituality, I'm not necessarily interested in spirituality. I'm interested in, the way religion has a sense of organization. But in terms of a writing perspective, I think reading a lot of writing, I think what's really interesting is that I think art writing sometimes struggles to account for some of the intuitive elements of artist process, some of the elements that are actually beyond reason, that might actually highly inform the way a work is created. And I'm not saying that's a fault of art writing, it's just the fact that sometimes, I'm not trying to kind of mystify artist processes too much, the way you make work has an element that is actually somewhat beyond cerebral. And it's really difficult to account and explain that, and even actually provide the weight that that sometimes has without falling into, historical, racist, sexist kind of tropes that kind of, distinguish, mind, body, intellect, reason. So I think sometimes strategically, when I talk about how my work is made, I think sometimes a bit of honesty is quite destabilizing in the fact that, even the sculpture outside, the incredibly muddy side, that idea came through actually mixing the materials and feeling it on my hand and feeling the coarseness, and then actually thinking about the way that might register discursively.
Well, I guess that idea of discourse is what's the main thing here, is that how do you describe intuition with language when it's a feeling that sometimes you can't even explain, in your own body and in your own kind of tacticity, I suppose, when making or performing. No, thank you. That's really got me thinking about that. But any other questions from anyone? No, that's fine. Should we wrap it up? Thank you for your time, everyone. So thank you, Ramesh. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Rakini. Hope everyone enjoys the fair.